after you arrived in England, did you see combat?
Well, let's see, we arrived in England in, I believe, late October of the year,
Yes?
and it was in January of 45
5?
that we saw combat.
Now, when you saw combat, did you go into the fight, or did this Bulge happen? Was it a surprise?
Well, the Battle of the Bulge wasn't named until after the battle. It became a much unusual one simply because a lot of both sides, the Germans and the Americans, didn't really know exactly where they were or what they were doing.
I see.
And in this sense, I said they didn't know what they were doing, is that it was about 30-some degrees below zero, extremely stormy, a lot of fog. You couldn't see more than a few feet in front of your face at times.
Uh-huh.
And we as a troop were designated to go out at night,
And reconnoiter?
study the topography, pick up any unusual activities, such as the Germans, where they were stationed, where their guards were, which was almost an impossible task.
Because of the mountainous terrain and the snow?
Yes, and your inability to do any more than walk. They did take some tanks in. They took some half tracks in that could go. I happened to be a driver in a Jeep armored car, which with a 20 millimeter mortar,
20 millimeter mortar.
and I had one assistant to help me set it up and fire it when necessary. What this really means is that we were really in the horse cavalry,
Right, the armored calf.
and all the horses were wiped out, and all the metal machines came in. So now we're known, or at least then, as the 41st Mechanized Cavalry.
Okay.
And I do remember now I was in Troop D.
Troop D.
I do not know how many there was in our brigade. There are somewhere around 1,000. And if I seem a little hazy on a lot of the names, the places, just imagine where you would have been when you were 19 years old and you were cut loose to fight a war.
Right.
We were sent out on night missions,
Night missions, uh-huh.
and usually there would be 10 to 12 of us in a unit. You were not allowed to expose yourself to anyone, and you were simply to watch, take back all the information you could the following morning to help the day crew, so to speak. And that's all that we ever did. When did I see my first soldier?
Right, your first German soldier.
The first German soldier that I ever saw. There were two of them holding guard duty out in the Ardennes.
In the Ardennes.
And what was so tricky about it was the Germans had that ground before we did.
Right.
And so they would lay traps in the ground, and string would be connected from one of the traps to an explosive.
I see.
You might lose a foot, you might be killed. Awfully hard to see anything of that nature when you're walking in 3 and 6 feet of snow.
And
So that's when I saw my first German, and I couldn't shoot.
what was your impression of the quality of the mighty German Wehrmacht soldiers at that time near the end of the war?
Well, at that time, remember it was getting very close to the end of the war.
Yes.
In the ETO, the European Theater.
Yes.
So that we didn't see the really first class soldiers. We saw 14-year-old kids with guns who knew very little about what they were doing.
Right.
Later in the war, we captured any number of these
Kids?
kids. And the interesting thing about them was that as soon as they knew they were captured, they would put their hands behind their head
Yes.
like this, and they would say, "Comrade."
Or kaput?
Don't recall that. Don't recall that. They were a bad breed of cats, because we'd have maybe a man assigned to walk 10 or 12 of them out and into captivity.
Uh-huh.
The problem was that you turned your head and you'd have a knife between your shoulder blades.
They just wouldn't give up.
They just wouldn't give up, and they had all kinds of tricks. The string one was just part of it. Knifing, and they were highly devoted to the German cause, and for them, their lives to be taken, much like the Japanese, no big deal.
Right. They wanted to win. When you were wounded, what were you doing when you were wounded, or how were you wounded?
Well, when we were wounded, and how I was wounded was that we were on the march.
On the
by
march.
feet. And our units were moving so fast that the supplies in the rear couldn't keep up.
With the front line?
The Germans were firing what were called, I'm trying to think now,
88
88
millimeters?
were one of them, and they were deadly accurate. That was actually a French gun, and the Americans didn't want them. So the French bought them, and believe me, when the Germans fired one, they could say they could put a bullet in your back pocket after 3 shots. In other words, they zero in. We didn't have anything that would compare to it. Now, had our maintenance crews and gasoline, serviceable items for the equipment, food for the soldier,
Right.
kept up with us, or even got started, the war probably would have been over. There wouldn't have been really a battle of the Bulge, because the Germans were coming one way in the dark, and we were going the other way in the dark. Now, what the day crews did and how they went into combat, or how they were hit, I don't know. I I was hit by what was called and I'd have to think about this with a little bit.
It was a tree strike or a
Yeah.
air strike round?
Well, when they fired a gun, the bullet would come over above the tree,
Above the trees.
and it would explode in a downward
And rain
pattern.
shrapnel down like an umbrella.
And the shrapnel, yes. The shrapnel is what got me. I could hear, they had a gun also they called the Screaming Mimes.
Right.
And they were really a psychological gun because they could just strike fear in you in nothing flat. At any rate, one of these went off somewhere above my head, not too far away, and I had thrown my hands up like this,
Uh-huh.
and I was just on the way to dropping my whole body on top of the grass or the snow,
Uh-huh.
and a fragment of the shell came right down through this part of my hand.
To that tendon right there. Now,
So that was really called the $1 million wound.
$1 million wound, because it wasn't life-threatening, but it could send you home.
It didn't send you home immediately. They got you out of the country. Otherwise, our mortality rate was pretty darn high.
Like 80%?
I don't know.
And then when
I
you,
don't know.
did, so you only have 3 fingers on your right hand.
Well, that's what I have now.
That's what you have now, because
I did have 4 fingers when I was hit.
you had 4 fingers in your hip. Well, that's good.
So what they decided, that medical doctors, later on, and this finger came out at about an angle like that.
Right?
You'd go to put your hand in your pocket, you had no feeling in it. You couldn't get your hand in your pocket, and it just about drove me crazy. So they decided that due to blood clots being able to form in there, which would go to your heart, and that would be the end.
Right.
They took the skin off of the little finger. It took the guts of it out,
Uh-huh.
and they filleted it, in other words.
Right.
That they took the skin, and that's the cushion that was made out of it.
I see.
This part of the little finger is this part right here.
Oh.
And it served me very, very well. I've never had any trouble with it after any number of operations.
And you received the Purple Heart
Yes.
right here, along with other things. Okay, and we're going to go to tape number 3.